Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 40 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I have a special guest, a person that has had significant influence on my way of thinking, Lawrence Reed. Welcome to the show, Lawrence.
Hey, thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate your having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And we were talking pre-show here that, there have been a number of people who have had a great deal of influence on me and people that I follow periodically reading their work. And you're certainly one of those. So it's means a great deal for you to take the time to join the show. And I certainly appreciate you being on the show. I think our listeners will enjoy hearing what you have to say.
Well, I'm honored and I appreciate that very much.
Yeah. So for those of our listeners who don't know Lawrence Reed, you go by Larry. So I'll be referring to you as Larry throughout the show, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Larry is the Foundation for Economic Education's President Emeritus after having served as president of FEE from 2008 to 2019. And most of our listeners should know what FEE is. It's the Foundation for Economic Education. I've referenced it and work from FEE on quite a few occasions. Larry has served as the chairman of FEE's Board of Trustees. He did that in the 90s and has been writing and speaking for FEE since the late 1970s. And prior to becoming FEE's president, Larry served as president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Midland, Michigan. And he also taught economics full-time from 1977 to 1984 at Northwood University in Michigan and chaired its Department of Economics from 1982 to 1984. A champion for liberty, Reed has authored nearly 2,000 newspaper columns and articles and dozens of articles in magazines and journals in the United States and abroad. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, USA Today, the Epoch Times, the Washington Examiner, and many others. He has also authored or co-authored at least 8 books by now. The most recent being, I believe, was Jesus, a Socialist. Larry is also the author of Are We Good Enough for Liberty, the book we'll be discussing today. And there's certainly a great deal more to say about Larry's accomplishments and his efforts toward the advancement of liberty, but I've hit many of the highlights that I gleaned from FEE's website here. Larry, is there anything essential that I've missed that you think our listeners should know about you?
Oh, not really, Alex. You could always have simply introduced me the way Ed McMahon used to introduce Johnny Carson and just say, "Here's Larry." That would be fine too.
Well, I suppose I could do both. Here's Larry, right?
I practice humility and I preach humility.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are going to be talking about that a little bit today. We'll be talking about character and virtue to some extent, and I think humility certainly falls into that category.
Yes.
But anyway, I appreciate you joining the show. I reached out to you, of course, by email. And I don't think I told you this, but I read your recent article called "Wanted: Moral Courage," which linked to the book, Are We Good Enough for Liberty? I hadn't read the book previously, so I read the book and I loved it and thought it'd be worth discussing on the show. So you graciously accepted my invitation, and here we are. So I think just to get into the topic, are we good enough for liberty? It's I think an interesting question, one that we should contemplate as people who want a free society and who advocate for a free society, because it's essential to a free society, I think, to be able to grapple with this question and sort of self-reflect. So I guess to start out, what motivated you to write this book?
Alex, I think many factors played a role in motivating me. This was many years in the making. Even though it's not a very long book, the thought behind it goes back quite a while. I've been making the case for liberty in various ways over the years. Sometimes I'll argue that it's the most productive system. You know, if you believe that more stuff is important, and it is in the sense that food and drink and housing and those kinds of material things are critical to our standard of living. Well, then you should be for liberty because people tend to produce more in a system in which they are free. And there are other arguments that I made for liberty, but I always thought there was something missing, that there was an element that our side, you might say, those of us who believe in liberty, were underemphasizing. And over the years, that kind of coalesced in my mind around the term character. I think character is often the missing ingredient in our case for liberty. That too often we argue from a material standpoint that we should be free because it will produce more stuff. And I think liberty is more lofty even than that, that it is the only political, economic, social arrangement which requires that people live to high standards of character. And so in recent years, I've tried through the book and in my public speaking to emphasize this, that a nation that doesn't maintain its character, high standards of character, will not sustain its liberty. And I don't know of any nation in all of history, in fact, that lost its character and kept its liberties. That's how important character is. So the point of the book ultimately is to make the connection between liberty and character, because I think that they are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. And I think you, I don't know what page it's on, but at some point in the book, you mentioned that essentially people have to make a choice, either govern yourself or be governed.
Yes.
And I think that's exactly the point that you're making here, this link, this two sides of the same coin. There are a few examples that you give in the book of people who have displayed character, and I don't want to overlook the blinking lights story from Warsaw, Poland. Would you mind to say a little bit about that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Poland has always been very special to me since my first visit there in 1986, when it was still run by a communist regime. And I'm happy to say here very soon I'll be going back to Warsaw to receive an award from the government, which is the highest honor they bestow upon a foreigner. And it's largely because of the work I did in Poland when it was communist in the 1980s. But in 1986, 3 years before the big changes that saw the communist regime ended and the fall of the Eastern European empire of the Soviet Union, Poland was still a dark place. It still had lingering elements of martial law that the government had imposed in 1981. Of course, it still had a one-party communist monopoly on political power and a socialized economy. Pretty dreary place. Nobody could have known then that it would be less than 3 years before Poland would get rid of the communists and all of Eastern Europe would be free. But I spent a couple of weeks there in November of 86, each night staying at a different home of someone who had something to do with the anti-communist underground resistance. And one evening, my escorts told me that there was a very special couple that they wanted me to meet that evening. We would be going to their apartment. Their names were Zbigniew and Sofia Romaszewski. And I'd never heard of them before, but it turned out they had run underground radio for Solidarity, the organization of Lech Walesa that was banned when martial law was declared. And they went underground when martial law was declared in December of 81 and were broadcasting from an illegal radio transmitter a message of freedom for Poland. And they were found out in the middle of 82, and he was given 4 years in prison. She was given 3. And in November of 86, when I was in their apartment, neither of them had been out of prison for very long. And they were active again in the underground, not with radio, but in other ways. And I asked them many questions that night about what it was like to run an underground illegal radio. Sophia answered most of those questions. And one of them was, how did you know if people were listening? And think about it. It's an illegal radio transmitter. You can't advertise. How do you know if people are tuning in? So I asked her that, and she said, well, we wondered that too. We had to broadcast only 8 or 10 minutes at a time, then tear the radio down, take it someplace else, and set it back up again, and broadcast 8 or 10 minutes, and then do the same thing over and over, trying to stay a step ahead of the government. And she said one night while we were broadcasting, we asked people if they believed in the message of the radio station, if they believed in freedom for Poland. We asked them, she said, to blink their lights. And then she said, we then went to the window, and for hours, all of Warsaw was blinking. And, all these years later, and she's still living, by the way, I still get goosebumps when I tell that story, because it's a testimony to the courage of that couple, so emblematic of the courage of millions of Poles who prevailed ultimately against the evil empire and threw off the yoke of communism in 1989.
It gives me goosebumps just hearing you tell it, and it gave me goosebumps reading the story as I read your book. It's an amazing story, really, because, like you say, there was no advertising, there were no tracking cookies like there are on the internet today, and that's an amazing story. Just I can't imagine looking out the window and seeing all those blinking lights over a city occupied by a communist government.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a great postscript to the story, by the way. He, Zbigniew, ran in those first free elections in June of 89 that saw every seat that the communists allowed to be contested lost by the communists. He won a seat in the lower house, later moved up and was elected to the Senate, and passed away only 7 or 8 years ago. But she is still living, and I hope to see her when I next go to Poland.
And I should say too, before I forget, congratulations on being selected for the award. What's the name of the award?
It's called the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. Okay. And I'm proud to say that President Reagan is one of the former recipients.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Well, congratulations for that. When do you anticipate receiving the award?
Latest word is it should be in late September, but they haven't confirmed a firm date yet. Ukraine has actually held it up. I thought it was going to happen before this, but as you might imagine, Poland has been up to its eyeballs in dealing with the aftermath of the invasion and the ongoing invasion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to. You've mentioned a few other stories here in your book too, that about the exemplification of character and doing the right thing even when it's difficult. One passage you mentioned, you tell a story about a Cambodian man who delivers the mail. Yeah. You mind to actually just tell that story real quickly? I don't want to drag you through to tell all these stories, but I think this is another great one to tell.
Oh, thank you. No, I love to tell this story. This goes back to my visit to Cambodia in August of 1989. And if you or any of your viewers watched the movie, it came out in 1985, I think, called The Killing Fields. The man who played the role of Dith Pran, his name was Dr. Hang S. Noor. He won an Academy Award for that. I went back to his native Cambodia with him in 1989. And before I went, there was a story in our local newspaper there in Michigan where I was living about the fact that I was going with Hang Noor. I had brought him to our town. He'd spoken before a public audience in Midland, Michigan. And I got a call from a local lady who said, "Oh, Mr. Reed, I see you're going to Cambodia and that you're taking some medical supplies with you." We at our church here in Midland helped 3 Cambodian refugee families some years ago to get started in the U.S., and they now live elsewhere in the country, but we stay in touch. But they have a problem every time they try to communicate with their loved ones back in Cambodia, the letters don't show up. Or if they put money in the envelopes, the money doesn't show up. They would love for you to take letters, if you be so kind, and try to find their families and deliver them in person with some money in the envelopes. And I said, sure, I'll do my best. And she said, now don't come back with any of the money in the envelopes. If you can't reach a certain family, bring the letter back, but give the money to a needy Cambodian. Of course, they were everywhere. And I realized the day before I was to leave to come home from Cambodia that I wasn't going to make it to that third family. They were some distance from the capital of Phnom Penh, and I knew I wasn't going to get there. So I had to think about who am I going to give the $200 to that are in this envelope. And I thought, well, there was a local guy who was giving me a ride every now and then during the week on his rickshaw. And he seemed like a nice fellow. He smiled easily. I just sensed that he was a good soul, spoke some English. So I gave him the $200, and I said to him, if you can deliver this along with the letter, I didn't want to bring the letter back. I said, take the letter and the $200, and if you can get it to this family, you can keep $50 of the 200. Well, then I left for home. And, like most people, I didn't expect ever to hear anything further about it. But about 6 months later, the woman who had first called me and asked me to deliver those letters was all excited on the phone. And she said, Larry, I have a copy in front of me of a letter that came to one of our refugee families that we helped from their loved ones back in Cambodia. And I have to read this paragraph to you. And that was the part that read, thank you for sending the $200. Now, what that said was that this man who had so little, probably didn't have $5 in life savings, he not only delivered that letter to those people, he didn't even keep the $50 I told him he could keep. And that said something to me, that man was a man of solid character. And if there were ever an occasion when my life depended upon him in some way, if he just appeared somewhere and all of a sudden I was that dependent upon him, I would trust him completely. Because in a moment when he didn't have to, when nobody was looking and no one would have known, or hardly anybody would have known otherwise, he did the right thing. And he went over and above doing just the right thing. And I just wish I knew how to contact him today to thank him if he's still around.
Yeah. It's an amazing story because there was nothing for him to be gained from that. I mean, he could have kept the $50 and that would have been completely a virtuous act as well. Not quite as virtuous as having passed along the entirety of the $200. But
even if there wasn't much to be gained, there was certainly something really big to have lost, and that is your conscience.
Yes.
And he had enough of a conscience. He knew he didn't want to lose it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think those are wonderful stories, and I think motivate people. That you tell these stories at the beginning of your book, and I think, tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think partly as a way to motivate people to keep going in your book about why character matters and to figure out where it comes from.
I'm a big believer in storytelling. I think you can make a point in straight lecture with just facts and figures, perhaps a sterile presentation, but if you wrap it around a true story, I think it sticks with people much more so.
Mm-hmm. And I think you close out the portion of your book here nicely with the words of Apostle Paul while he was in prison. You say shortly before he was martyred, it is recorded in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith.
Yes.
And, that sort of demonstrates or sort of captures the idea of these stories to some degree.
Yeah, I think so. And I often refer to that passage in public speaking because I want people to know that the one thing over which they have the greatest control is their personal character. And it's probably the one thing in which they could not possibly invest too much. Uh, I tell audiences of young people that investing in your character from the moment you realize how important it is something that you will never regret. And yet we see every day people who pass on from this earth without much of anything of value left behind in terms of an example. And I always find that to be so sad. I would hate to get to the point in life where I look back on my life and honestly say, gee, I didn't make much of a difference. And when I did, it was often as not for the bad, not for the good. I wasn't a good example. The world's not better because I was in it for a time. I'd hate to have to say all that. I'd love to be able to say, though not perfect, I tried my best to do what I thought was right whenever I had the opportunity to do so. And that's a question of conscience and character, and you cannot invest in either one too much.
And that's certainly a wonderful way to be remembered.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's ultimately what people will remember you for if they do it all, more than the wealth that you had or they remember you for the kind of person you were more than anything else. And that's how you make a difference with other people, to try to be the best example you can be as a parent, as a friend, as a fellow citizen.
And they don't have to be through these extravagant acts of, motivating people to blink their lights in Warsaw, Poland, or delivering the entirety of a $200 when you're poor and destitute. Character is found in the small things, right? You mind to say, well, actually, before we get into that, I'd like to mention too, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Blinking Lights Project. Do you mind to say a little bit about the Blinking Lights Project?
Yes, that is something that we inaugurated at the Foundation for Economic Education some 9 or 10 years ago, I think. And of course, I retired 4 years ago, and with a new president, it may have a little different emphasis than it did under me, but because it was so personal to me and my first visit to Poland. But the Blinking Lights Project was a way of not only memorializing that great moment in 1986 when Sofia Romaszewski shared that story with me, but also a way to spotlight other people who are themselves blinking lights. So, as part of a project, we created a Blinking Lights Award, and we gave it over the years to people who exemplify strong character in difficult circumstances. One is a man still living, still teaching in Caracas, Venezuela, Daniel LaHood. We gave it to him because in such a difficult place like socialist Venezuela, he is teaching his students as best he can the elements of a free market, free enterprise system, and at some risk to himself. Another man we gave it to has since passed on, Toshio Murata. He was one of the best economists from Japan that country produced in the last century. He translated a great work of the economist Ludwig von Mises, a book called Human Action, into Japanese. He was a great lover of liberty, and all the way well into his 90s, he never gave in. He used every opportunity he could to educate for ideas of liberty. And a few other people over the years, just to recognize people who are blinking the light of liberty, even though they may not be getting public awards and commendations. They do it because it's the right thing to do, and they love doing it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a wonderful visual, just to, imagine the blinking lights in Warsaw, and then also the people who are living a life and striving to live with good character, and to live a virtuous life and a good life, and be an example to others, a light to others, not only for liberty, but for living a virtuous life.
Yes.
So I love that visual. with that said, I'd like to get into the next section of your book about where does character come from. We talked about a couple of these stories, and we mentioned that character doesn't always mean engaging in these extravagant acts of demonstrations of character, but sometimes it's the small things. A lot of times it's the small things. Do you mind to talk a little bit about that and where character comes from?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Uh, I like to tell people there are two sources ultimately of character. They're not incompatible with each other. Which one is the more important to you may depend upon your faith or lack thereof. In my case, I'm a Christian, so I very strongly believe that the primary source of the elements of strong character are God given, God mandated, in fact. They are such traits as honesty, that is a commitment to the truth, speaking truth to power, not engaging in prevarication and deceit and deception and lies. Now, I can cite scripture, of course, that indicates that God wants you to be faithful to the truth, but I could also say that the other source of character is perfectly in accord with the two, and that is our nature. I don't think humans can survive in an environment where nobody believes in the truth. Everybody practices lies. I mean, how could you make a contract? How could you make an agreement with anybody if nobody felt any commitment to sticking with it? If they broke it at the drop of a hat for personal advantage. So honesty, I think you can look to God's word as the ultimate source of that as a character trait, or you can argue that our very nature requires it, lest we suffer dire consequences. Another character trait is humility. Certainly, the Bible, in many occasions, many places, talks about the importance of humility, which does not mean running yourself down. Some people think humility means, running around saying, "Oh, I'm worthless, I'm no good." That's not what it means at all. In fact, we think of it. I think of it more in an intellectual sense, intellectual humility, which is the recognition that as much as you might know, there's still a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know. And that's the way God created the universe. But I think if you didn't think of God at all, you'd have to be led to the same conclusion. That as much as any of us knows, as much as all of us together know, that's still nothing compared to the knowledge out there that we don't know. The more humble a person is, the more he tends to focus on self-improvement, the less likely he or she is to want to lord it over others. I mean, it's a full-time job just keeping your own character straight and honest and living your own life well, let alone trying to, force everybody else into your plan. Mm-hmm. So intellectual humility is an important trait. Responsibility, stepping up to the plate, not blaming others for your mistakes or your poor judgments. Courage is another element here in character. I don't think a timid people will be a free people, because the world is full of people who would be happy to take your liberties from you if they thought they had the chance. So I think character comes both from the way we were made as God intended, but even if you didn't bring God into the equation, I think you'd be led to the same conclusion if you look at just the nature of humans.
Mm-hmm. I think I tend to agree with that. That I think whether or not you believe in God, I think there is this natural order to the world, and there are many folks who believe that God created that natural order, and some who think it just developed organically. But either way, it's I think it requires this character, because I like this example you give. I don't remember what page it's on, but that intelligence plus energy without character is basically destructive. Because character is that key component. And you mentioned that character is essential basically for our humanity, because otherwise we may self-destruct.
As I recall, I think I brought that up in connection with hiring. Mm-hmm. Over the years as an employer. I've been confronted with many occasions when I had, on the one hand, maybe got down to a person who was of solid character but didn't really know the subject matter real well, versus another person who knew the subject backwards and forwards, had multiple degrees in it, but then had questionable character. And I think I pointed out in the book that if I had to make a choice between the two, I wouldn't hesitate to pick the one who had character first, because I know that person is teachable. That person is going to be honest enough to admit they've got a ways to go and will work at it and be good to work with. But you find somebody who may know everything about the subject but is of lousy character, you hire that person, they can do you immense harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the world would certainly be a better place if there were more people like the poor Cambodian man, not necessarily the poor part, but people who had his character.
Yeah,
And even though he may not be educated in the least, at least he had the character, as you
yeah,
say, to sort of mold and to work with.
yeah, absolutely. I think I'd hire him for anything.
Yeah. And you also mentioned another passage from the Bible here, Luke 16:10. This is one of my favorites. Unless you are faithful in small matters, you will not be faithful in large ones.
Yeah.
And I think that the Cambodian man is a perfect example of that.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I think so many people cut corners because they think, oh, it's such a small thing. Who will care? It's no big deal. But that's the beginning of the so-called slippery slope. And a person who cuts the corners on the small things will, in time, I think, be more than willing to cut corners on the big things. And I want to be able to say, and I think most people would too, when you look back in your life, that even in the small things, you try to do what you knew to be right, and
Mm-hmm.
weren't the kind of person who prevaricated and cut corners just for short-term advantage.
Yeah. And as you say, too, after this passage, even those of no faith should see the wisdom of it. And I think that's
Yeah.
true. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I like to tell audiences is consider how we were made, whether you think we're an accident or whether we're the result of intelligent design, a God, a creator. Well, we're not carbon copies of each other, are we? I mean, you take all 8 billion people alive today and all the who knows how many billions that have been alive on this earth, no two of them have ever been, as far as we can tell, exactly alike. The same person has never lived twice. And that speaks volumes about the importance of liberty, of freedom. I mean, if we were all just robots, uh, no different one to another, that would make a case, I guess, for there simply to be some wise planner out there who can program us all. But that's not the way we were made. We are unique, each and every one of us, and that tells me that to be who you were intended to be, who you are, you have to be given substantial freedom. If somebody else is telling you at every turn what to do, you're not living your life. He's living his life through you. And you can come to that conclusion whether you believe we were created or whether we're just some cosmic accident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's generally the problem with most government action is it takes a one size fits all approach
Yeah,
to humanity, and we're all unique, as you say, and I think prosper and achieve our humanity through freedom and acting out, our life in the way that we find to be most fulfilling.
that's right.
Yeah. That I like to use the concept from the ancient Greeks of eudaimonia, achieving this sort of more fulfilling happiness, not the pleasure that we so often seek in modern society, but
Yeah,
a higher degree of happiness. And I
yeah.
think that's consistent with what you've written here as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. That reminds me of how, so many people like to dismiss people in the business world, entrepreneurs. They say, oh, well, they're just after wealth. They just like to sit around and play with their gold coins. But most of the entrepreneurs I know get far more fulfillment out of the sense of accomplishment, of pleasing customers, of solving problems, creating something. They get more satisfaction out of that than they do, personal wealth that flows from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like this point too. You've made this through our conversation here in different ways, but you say people who lack humility become arrogant, condescending, know-it-all central planner types, and I think that's exactly the type of person that uh, typically occupies positions in government, unfortunately.
Yeah,
But it sort of goes along with this notion of the fatal conceit, right? This
yeah,
thought that we know better than most and we can micromanage other people's lives. And that's
yeah,
exactly the opposite of the position that you're advocating and that we're advocating on this show. Would you mind to say just a little bit more about that?
yeah. Leonard Read, no relation, but he was the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education. He used to say that every human being starts out like an egg, and we hatch, and then we grow, and we all grow in our own direction, influenced by endless factors. But the bottom line is that what we ultimately as adults decide to do and how we govern our lives personally will tell the tale more than anything else. Um, he pointed out that at some point, every human, as an adult, if not as a child, should recognize that there's so much knowledge they don't know. We should look at creation around us in awe. That as much as we've learned about it in the last 50, 100 years with so much advance in science and technology, there's still as much to learn as ever. And that'll be true, just as true on the day we depart this earth as it was the day we entered it. And if we understand that, then the last thing we should want to do is to act toward others as if we know all there is to know to run their lives. We don't even know enough to run our own lives fully and predictably from day to day, let alone the lives of others. And yet there's so many people who set themselves up with political power thinking that I know what's best for other people. And so I'm going to regulate, I'm going to tell them what to do, I'm going to, just run their lives for them. And there's just no instance in history where that on a grand scale has proven anything other than disastrous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the next thing I'd like to get to here, you emphasize gratitude
Yes.
quite a bit. Would you mind to say why do you emphasize gratitude so much in the book?
I think gratitude is one of those top 5 or 6 personal character traits that define you and determine how successful you'll be in life, how much influence you'll have over others, having a grateful spirit. There was a team of bioethicists led by a man named Emmons some years ago who wrote a book. I don't recall the title, but the author is Mr. Emmons or Dr. Emmons.
I have it here in front of me. Thanks, how practicing gratitude can make you happier.
Okay, great. Yeah,
Yeah,
kind of a
yeah,
long title. That's why I
yeah.
forgot it, I guess.
Right.
But he points out in there that as a result of their research, they believe that having a grateful spirit can add as much as 7 or 8 years to your life, to your physical life. When you think about it, gratitude is really the recognition that not all the good things that have happened to you have been of your own doing. I mean, who in their right mind, if you really think about it, could claim that, oh, every good thing that's ever happened to me, I've been at the source of it? Not really. From your parents through your life, a lot of good will come your way, and it won't be of your doing. It may not even be because you earned it. It may simply be because of the goodwill of someone else. It may be an invention that someone else invented, the food that you eat that somebody else grew. Endless examples of it. But having a grateful spirit means that you recognize that and that you acknowledge it. That when you come across a person who did something for you that maybe they didn't have to, but they did, and it was a good thing, well, thank them for it. And I don't know a person who doesn't feel better when they bring themselves to express thanks for a good deed. And I don't know of a person who has done a good deed who doesn't feel a little bit better when they're thanked. So if you want more good deeds to happen to you and to others, recognize them. Thank those who do them. and then don't be surprised that you'll see more of them.
I love this portion of your book. I think that gratitude is often an overlooked component of an enriching life,
Yes,
or a fulfilling life. And as you were talking, you mentioned Leonard Reed earlier. I think sometimes it helps to sort of think about our place in the world. And of course, Leonard Reed wrote the book I Pencil, and which sort of demonstrates the complexity of the simple things in life,
yes,
and sort of the power of voluntary exchange and free markets, and the things that exist because of that voluntary cooperation. And I think if you take the time to reflect on those sorts of things, it makes you appreciate the things that we do have that we
yeah,
often take for granted. I mean, you and I are speaking over the internet right now, and I often take the internet for granted, but we wouldn't be having this conversation if not for the internet, which is far more complex than a pencil.
that's right.
Uh, so I think that gratitude is highly overlooked, and I'm glad that you emphasize it so much in the book. And on top of that, as you say, it may in fact increase your lifespan. So,
Yeah, I think so. And if you have children, I think saying thank you to a child and teaching them when the proper occasions are to thank others is one of the most instructive and valuable things as a parent you can do. It's still that grateful spirit into young people at an early age. And I think you'll see the magic that comes from it.
hmm
How many
I
times do we run into angry people all the time who can't bring themselves to say thank you? Do you think
uh,
Karl Marx ever went into a hardware store and said to the owner, "Hey, thank you for taking the risk and creating this enterprise and making sure everything I need is right here whenever I want it"? You can't
right.
imagine an angry, nasty communist like Karl Marx ever smiling and saying thank you to anybody.
hmm Yeah.
But yeah,
The more likely question was, did you make any profit from that? And if
that's
so,
right. Yeah,
where's my where's my portion?
that's right.
Yeah,
You must have taken
yeah.
it from me. Who wants to go through life with such an angry, ungrateful spirit?
Right. Right. I don't recall. It just came to mind. I heard recently about this effect. It's called the Pygmalion effect. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it basically is a fancy name for a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Uh,
And I think that that's true to some degree with a gracious spirit that, if you're thankful for things, good things will come to
yeah,
some degree.
yeah,
Of course, that's not always true, but that's been my experience, and I think it's something that you have to intentionally focus on is
yeah.
being gracious, because it's easy to let negativity seep into your
Yeah.
life.
It's easy to take so much for granted, especially
Mhm.
here in America where we have such abundance of so many things. But all you have to do is think about all the many people in the world and in history who haven't had anything like what's been available to us, and you have to recognize that and be grateful for the fact that we've been so blessed.
Mhm. Indeed, indeed. So, one thing you mentioned, obviously, uh, I think if it's not apparent, I think most people are probably following us in the assertion that character is necessary for liberty. But it seems like more and more that character is lacking in
Yeah.
society. How can we change that? How can we change the tide to a more virtuous society with more character?
Boy, that's the paramount question of our day, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's so important that if we don't fix the character problem, not much of whatever we might do on anything else is going to make much difference. As I said earlier, I don't know of any society that lost its character and kept its liberties or kept its prosperity. Well, I think this is a matter for every individual and you can't impart what you don't possess. So if you understand the importance of character, then the first thing you got to ask yourself is, am I a good example of it? Because I'm not going to be a very good exponent of it or proponent of it if I'm not seen by others I hope to influence as a practitioner of it. Nobody likes a hypocrite. Nobody likes to run into someone who practices one thing and preaches another. So you have to ask yourself, what can I do to improve my own character? Not only as I see it, but as others perhaps are perceiving. How are my children perceiving my behavior? Am I the best possible example for them? And if you work on it, and there are things you can read, of course, that will make you more knowledgeable and appreciative of the elements of character. But most people, when they think much about it, can come up with them on their own. Honesty, humility, responsibility, courage, gratitude, and so forth. So make sure you practice it first and foremost, and then support others who do, especially if they're running for public office. The reason I brought politics into it is that it's a source of constant dismay to me to see so many people in public office who have proven themselves to be of lousy character, but who get elected and reelected and reelected. It's as if to the people, it doesn't matter that they're crooks as long as they bring home the bacon. That's a sign not just of a corrupt politician, but of a corrupt people.
Well, you and I'm sorry to interrupt here, but you tell a story about an ethanol subsidy in the book. Do you mind to just say something about that real quickly?
Yeah. Are you thinking about the soybean farmer? Is that the example?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. He was a very good friend. I always thought highly of him. He's since passed on, but very good friend and a soybean farmer. And when I was running the Mackinac Center, he was one of our staunchest supporters. But he told me one day, he said, "Larry, I'm for freedom and free markets in everything but soybeans." And he he actually meant it. And I thought, well, nobody's perfect, but my goal in life was to try to get him to realize that even subsidies for his important work were not morally defensible.
Mm-hmm. But that's the problem, right? Is that almost everybody has their equivalent of a soybean subsidy, an interest that they want a politician to provide to them at the expense of someone else.
That's right. And it gets to the factor I just mentioned about being a good example. How could such a person make a case to anyone against government subsidies and in favor of personal reliance and free markets if everybody knows he's on the take himself? Mm-hmm. It just undermines your persuasiveness to be a bit of a hypocrite on that, even though you mean well. I know he did, but still, I think there's a special place on this earth and in the hereafter for those who live up to their principles, even when it may not be to their short-term economic advantage to do so, but because it's morally right. But today, so many people cut corners all the time. They make exceptions for what they know to be true and right all the time. And I don't know of any society that did that on a wide scale that didn't end up in the dumpster. That's just usually where it happens. It happens small, compromise here, cut corners there, advocate for what you know to be wrong, but just in this special case. And then before long, other people say, well, why shouldn't I do that for my special case? And then everybody's doing it. And then we go bankrupt. I mean, right. Yeah. I wish I could go back to ancient Rome and just have 1 hour with ancient Romans. And I would say, hey, let me just tell you, because I come from the future, I know where this is headed. You've voted for the welfare state. You're starting down that path. You all feel pretty good that you're getting something for nothing. But let me tell you from the future that I know where it's headed. You're going to bankrupt yourselves, lose your freedom, and lose your country. Now, do you still want to do it? I wonder how many would have the moral courage to say, hey, he's right. No, let's not do that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's I think the emphasis on making a change to yourself first, focusing on yourself, being an influence and encouraging others to live a life of character goes a lot further than people realize.
Yeah.
I think so often people, and I'd like to know your thoughts about this. So often people want to, when you say, how do we change the direction of our country or of the world. They expect some extravagant answer, some big action that we can take. But I think the most effective one is to focus on yourself and to change your own character or to enrich your own character and to work on your own character and hopefully have an exponential effect on those around you. Is that essentially the message?
Yeah, there is no magic button that you can press and make the world a better place. That all starts through a moral renovation, one person at a time, and you're in charge of that as regards yourself. And you'll discover that if you do that yourself and try to be the very best person that you can humanly be, you'll be amazed at the doors that it will open, the opportunities to influence that will occur, the lives that you can change because you set the example.
Yeah.
And you'll be amazed at how you can look back on your life someday and feel pretty darn good about it, that you left the world a better place than you found it.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yep.
That's the goal. So you also mentioned not only this link between character and liberty, but also, and this is related to our current discussion, the link between character and leadership, that those two are inextricably linked. Do you mind to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, leadership is not, or at least true leadership that really is inspirational, that sticks, that is there for the ages, is not barking orders. You might say, well, Adolf Hitler was a leader. Well, yeah, in a sense, but in a fleeting and negative way. A true leader, the one that people admire, the one that people want to follow, not because they have to follow him, but because they want to, is the kind of leader who leads by example, that you look up to and say, wow, I can take that person's word to the bank. That person has made himself an expert on the subject of leading others into battle or whatever the venture may be. They've made themselves the best at what they're doing in the business. That's what inspires other people in a very positive way to want to follow. And then such a leader doesn't have to bark orders. Usually, I used to like the Andy Griffith Show. Remember that?
Oh yeah,
70s and 80s.
It's one of the only shows I watch on a regular basis.
Oh, okay. Well, in hindsight, I look back on that and it dawned on me one day that I think I learned an important element of leadership from those episodes, because if you think about it, Andy usually had it in mind where he wanted to go on something, and he didn't get everybody on the same page by yelling at them or by barking orders at them. He kind of, unbeknownst to them in some ways, sort of led them in the right direction. And in the end, they came around and they were more solidly for it than if he had ordered them to be of that view right from the start.
Yeah.
And I think that's the essence of leadership. And it flows from being a good example, having emotional intelligence, being respectful of other people. Ultimately, all that is a reflection of character.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful example. I remember, and it makes me think of when I was a young child. I have an older brother, and my dad would often ask us if we knew what leadership was, which I always thought was an odd question to ask a young child. But I think he wanted to instill that attitude in us at an early age about how to be influential and not in a forceful way. But he would always say that it's influencing others to accomplish a common mission or goal.
Yeah.
And the key component of what you're talking about, I think, is that influence. And it's not through force or coercion. Leadership isn't. It's through volunteer, encouraging people or making people want to follow you because of the example that you've set. And that's often through, or most likely going to be through, exemplifying good character.
Yeah, exactly. If you want somebody to go to the nth degree on behalf of a shared goal, I think you want them to be as enthusiastic for it and as enthusiastic about the person who issued the order, uh, more so than than having because he had a gun in his head and was told to do it. How much have you won if somebody does something because you ordered them to, as opposed to they wanted to do it?
Right. Yeah. It's a far more powerful form of leadership if they
Yeah.
follow you voluntarily.
Yep.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, there's a section in your book here where you talk about today's heroes, teachers, businessmen, parents, and I think that the heroes that these examples you give are heroes in the not so grand sense, like the blinking lights heroes, but in the smaller day to day tasks. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I should point out that I think in all those professions that you just cited, teaching and a couple others that you mentioned,
Business and parents, yes, yeah.
business and parents, yeah, there are plenty of bad examples. Uh, I wouldn't necessarily hold up an entire profession and say that just by definition it is virtuous or a good thing. I know some bad teachers. Uh, America's universities, I'm afraid to say, are full of them today. Um, but the good ones in that profession and any profession are the ones who lead by example, who stress the importance of character, who, because you were their student, you're a better person, not just more knowledgeable of facts and figures, but a better person because of that teacher or that influencer. Those are the ones that I would say we should regard as heroic, who leave that kind of impression. But there are plenty in every profession who don't, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
I may have gotten off track there, Alex. I hope I
Oh
answered.
no problem. I think that I just wanted to draw out the fact that the people that we think of as heroes are often
Oh, yeah,
not the people that are on TV necessarily. They're the ones doing displaying character day to day in
that's
their
right.
everyday life. Yeah.
Especially the ones who do it when they don't have to,
Mm-hmm.
when to act in a different way might have given them some short term material advantage, but they did the right thing anyway. Those are the ones that I elevate to heroic status, who live lives of heroism, not just moments of heroism, but lives of heroism every day.
Yeah, it's easy to, I think to go in spurts and
Yeah,
to summon up the energy to do the right thing now and then, but to do it day in and day out is a totally different endeavor.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
We are
yeah,
really we're like gems just out of the mine uh, that need to be polished, and sometimes polishing is rough on us. But in the end, we're better people if we allow ourselves to be polished by circumstances that and allow our character to be so elevated by the circumstances we face. We're not better people if we face our circumstances in a way that is destructive of our character, doing things to get by for the moment. Um, I think you're rougher than before the polishing began.
yeah, yeah. That reminds me of and I'm gonna botch the quote, but and you may know it. I'm not sure, uh, but basically that people, an individual is both the sculptor and the stone, and the idea is that there isn't character without some pain. You have to shape yourself, to mold yourself,
Yeah,
uh, and I think that's true. You have to do difficult things if you're going to live a life day in and day out that's displays character and is virtuous. Um, but some might say, and you've mentioned alluded to this. What's the point of it? Why should we take the hard path, the path that maybe will require this pain or tough decision making? You mentioned, that it's a good way to be remembered if you live this life.
mm-hmm.
It also helps you live with a clear conscience. I think those are both great things, but why else should people care about living a virtuous life and one of character?
Well, if one is a believer in the Christian faith, and since I am, I'll start by elaborating on that. I want to be a person of good character because I believe that's what my Creator commanded that I do. I think He knew what He was talking about. But even if I were not a believer in God and His commandments, I think I would, just by my understanding of human nature and of science, that I would come to a lot of the same conclusions. That because we are unique individuals, it's very important that each of us treat everyone else in the same fashion that we would want to be treated. They have the same rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that I have. And it simply is disrespectful to our fellow citizens to be dishonest with them, or to be arrogant over them, or to be unhumble and irresponsible toward them, or to be timid in the face of their assaults if they're bad people. So I'm thinking that all these character traits that we've talked about that are so important to solid, strong, good character and freedom really amount to the golden rule in practice. Treat others as you would want them to treat you. And otherwise, you're kind of behaving like you're some special creature, but you're just as human as everybody else. What makes you so special that you get to dictate to them if they can't dictate to you?
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful example, and a good way to say it, that it's the golden rule in practice. I think the other component of it too, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, is that I think so often people think that acting in a way that isn't virtuous is the easier path, but it may be in the moment, but it's not long term.
Yeah.
And I think that it's like denying yourself ice cream, right? Because you're trying to stay fit, right? You don't engage in the lie or the deceit because it may be difficult in the moment, but you're gonna reap the reward of the seeds that you sow.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And it's going to come back to bite you sooner or later.
Mm-hmm.
And if you happen to be a Christian, then you know that sooner or later might be in the afterlife, but it could be on earth as well. That
Mm-hmm.
sooner or later, bad people are kind of found out in most cases. And an awful lot of them regret, but then can't undo what they did when they had the opportunity to act the right way. So you got to live with your conscience, all of us. And if you've got one, I think we should understand the importance of living up to high standards of character. Otherwise, our conscience will bother us till the day we die.
Mm-hmm. I've had you for just a little over an hour now. I'm going to try to wrap up because I know you've probably got other things to do as well. But one point you make that I don't often hear people make is that you say one of the strongest arguments for liberty, in my mind, is the fact that it is one and only it is the one and only social, political, economic arrangement that demands high character.
Yes.
And you juxtapose that with centrally planned governments. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Just imagine, if you would, a society where people either suddenly or over time decide, hey, truth isn't important. We don't have to be honest. Let's just do whatever makes us feel good for the moment or gives us some benefit or advantage. Truth is no big deal. Okay, well, imagine the same society also is no longer believes in humility, thinks that they know it all, think that, hey, I know better than the other guy how to live his life. You can't have freedom in those kinds of circumstances. A society of people who are not responsible. How are you going to be free? An irresponsible society means a society of people running around saying, hey, it's your fault, even though it's not. They never step up to the plate and hold themselves accountable for the mistakes they made. They always look for somebody else to blame. How can freedom exist in a society where everybody's trying to pin false blame on other people or being dishonest toward them. I mean, a dishonest, unhumble, impatient, timid, irresponsible people will not be a free people. You will end up with some kind of socialism, communism, some strongmanism that will run everybody's life, because otherwise you have chaos. The lack of character produces the chaos that is the fertile ground in which dictatorship and tyranny thrive.
I think that I like this point too, because any variety of government requires some degree of force, and I think by its very nature violates the golden rule. I mean, like you said earlier, where we are trying to live out the golden rule through living a virtuous life, and one of character and liberty. But I think we don't want to be ourselves don't want to be forced to do things that we don't want to do by other people. So why would we force others through the mechanism of government to do those things? And so I think that's a good point that you make here.
Yeah, it's an age-old struggle. I mean, America's founders knew that they wouldn't have argued against what you just said. They recognized that any government requires, by definition, some use of force. But they set about the task of creating an infrastructure whereby the use of force would be minimized, whereby it would be exercised in a just way, when it would be used to correct injustices rather than create new injustices. And they knew that was a tough challenge, that nobody had ever done it before and kept it forever. Even the ancient Romans, on whom we copied much of what they did when they formed their republic, even they lost it over time. Our founders were interested in, once we get the right things in place that minimizes the use of force by government, how do we keep it from devouring us over time? And we're still working on that, I guess. That answer hasn't yet been rendered.
Yeah. It's a never-ending problem to try to solve. So it seems. Well, Larry, I think we'll leave it here for now, and try to have you back on the show some point in the future, maybe to discuss the back half, or the portion of your book called "Liberty as a Life Philosophy." If you're willing to do that at some point in the future, we'll have you back on to do that. But before we close up, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing, or any resources you'd like to point out to our listeners?
Maybe a couple things. One point I want to say is, regardless of how dark things may look at the moment, maintain a sense of optimism, because its opposite, pessimism, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So good people can make a difference in the world as long as they don't give up. And the second thing I would recommend is, if people are browsing the internet and want to check out my website, I'd be grateful. It's lawrencewreed.com, LawrenceWreed, no punctuation in there, .com. And there I put all the articles that I write. And if you send me a link to this podcast, Alex, I will post it there as well.
Yeah, I will certainly send you the link to this podcast, and I will include your website in the show notes as well, so that our listeners have easy access to that. Well, Larry, I really appreciate you joining the show to discuss your book, Are We Good Enough for Liberty? And I'll link to that in the show notes as well, so that folks can access the book. And to close up here, I'll just finish, I think, with a quote that I got from page 13 of the book that I think is really great. It says, "If you want to be free, if you want to live in a free society, you must assign top priority to raising the caliber of your character and learning from those who already have it in spades. If you do not govern yourself, you will be governed." So, yeah. Thanks again, Larry, for joining the show. I really appreciate your time, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to help spread the message of freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.